Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Lawrence Moore of the Volitional Science Network, and Nima of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode 3, Sectoral Balances and Eurozone Insanity. So, hi Nima, great to talk to you again.
It's a pleasure to be on.
So, I guess we're continuing on the MMT brigade, because we still have some things to talk about, which is something very, very important, which sounds really boring. I understand this sectoral balances sounds really boring, but we promise it's more exciting than it sounds. We talked about before the statist origins of money and how, as strange as it sounds, that the government deficit is the private sector net savings. The fact that the government spends something into existence allows the private sector to have something to save and to spend. So we mentioned this in the earlier episodes, but there's another variable to all this, and it has to do with what's called the foreign sector. So there's actually 3 sectors. We talked about the government sector, the private sector. There's actually a foreign sector on top of this. So Nima, can you kind of give us a summary of these 3 sectors, and then we could delve into it a little bit?
Yeah. So as we talked about last time, we created a simple economy where you have just, a government issuing money and a private sector using the money. And there's also, in the real world, there's a third sector, which is the people who issue or use other money. So basically, that completes the picture. In any fiat money economy, if you want to categorize the actors in the economy based on their relation to the money of account, then you can separate them into the issuer, which is usually the government, the user, which is the private sector, and then the issuer and or user of some different money, some other money, which is the foreign sector.
So another country, essentially.
Exactly. That's usually how it works, yeah. So, if a foreign country, somebody from abroad comes into your country and wants to buy something, then they'll take their currency. It'll ultimately end up at the central bank, and they'll get U.S. currency that's created out of nowhere in the end. And then they'll spend it on goods in the U.S., and then the private sector accumulates foreign currency. And that foreign currency is turned to U.S. dollar, which basically acts as net private savings because it's not owed back. And so basically the private sector in any economy can accumulate such assets that are not owed back only in 2 ways. One is a government budget deficit. One is a current account surplus, meaning money is coming in from abroad. More money is coming in from abroad than is leaving the country.
So let me see if I got that straight, because we added some central bank stuff to it. So let's take, I don't know, want to take Canada or China or Argentina? What's your favorite country here?
China.
Okay, let's go with China. So, and actually we should kind of focus on China itself, because our money is moving toward China, not away from China. So essentially what happens is China, or some company in China, wants to sell its goods here in the United States. So they come over here to the United States and they sell the goods, and the Chinese company ends up with dollars and that they trek back over the ocean. I mean, not really, but it's a good image to help understand this. They trek back over the ocean back to China with these dollars, and when then they sit in China with these dollars going, well, I can't spend this on anything. That's not the unit of account here.
Yeah.
Well, so they go to the Chinese government central bank and they say, will you please exchange these dollars for my local unit of account, which is the yuan, so I could spend them. So what ends up happening is that dollars in the United States ends up in the hands of the Chinese government, or I guess more specifically the Chinese central bank, which is the same thing. Which is actually a net drain on the private sector here in the United States.
Exactly.
So even if, so like you were mentioning before, in this kind of simplistic world where we just have a private sector and a government sector, the government spends money into existence and it taxes it out of existence, and whatever is left over, the private sector gets to use and spend and save. Well, there's a third force, which is if an entity is bringing money as a foreign entity, which cannot create the unit of account, in this case dollars, is either pulling dollars out or bringing foreign currency in. And as you mentioned, if they do bring foreign currency in, it just gets exchanged at the central bank, in our case, the Federal Reserve, which essentially, in quotes, creates the money out of nothing. So the trade balance can also affect the private sector net savings in this way.
Yeah. The current account balance is easier to use because trade balance is a little different. But current account balance is exactly the money coming in versus money going out.
I was not aware that there was a difference, but
yeah, it's minor, but yeah,
I'll take your word for it. So, because we mentioned, I believe it was in the first episode, that there's a correlation that seems to have some significant evidence behind it, that government surpluses lead to economic crashes because it takes the money out of the system that the private sector has.
Yeah. Well,
that's not always the case now, is it?
Right.
Because there's a third variable here. Can you flesh that out for us?
The real figure to look at is net private savings, ultimately. We just used sort of the budget deficit in the U.S. as a proxy because the U.S. never really had much of a current account surplus. But in general, the total net private savings in the country is the sum of the government's budget deficit and the current account surplus. So you can have a country that runs a low budget deficit, but a very large current account surplus, and it's growing just fine. And the private sector financial position is sound and safe, and they're happy consuming and buying. And that is, for example, the case in Germany, where you can see, and we can post a link in the show notes here, over, for example, from 2000 or actually 99 through 2016, they've had pretty low government budget deficits. There's a couple of years where they have almost completely balanced budgets, but there's always run a very high current account surplus. And so the private sector net saving is always pretty large. And I believe it's similar for example, in Italy, which actually, no, sorry.
Japan.
Italy is a bad example. They haven't really had, they've had a couple of, most recently they've been building up their export sector. It seems they have a current account surplus that sort of started growing from 2012 through 2016 and onwards. But Germany is definitely a very good example. And Greece would be an example for the opposite of that. I don't know if we want to go into Greece quite yet, but Greece is a country with a current account deficit, almost chronic current account deficit, and thus a pretty shaky private sector position, and which is also part of the reason why they've had this depression starting 2009. And now supposedly they've changed things, and they've definitely improved their financial position a little bit since then, but it remains to be seen whether it's going to be sustainable.
But before we get deeper into Greece, because as the show is called Eurozone Insanity, we definitely want to get into the Eurozone. Yeah. I wanted to look at a little bit more of what's going on back home. Well, I guess home is vaguely Germany for you, but what's going on here in the United States. Because when we look at the history of the crashes in the United States, as you mentioned, the United States doesn't really have a history of a current account surplus. When we had our first 6 crashes, the correlation was like 1-to-1 with federal government surpluses, immediately or preceding every crash. Well, our most recent crash, or in quotes, Great Recession, actually had a mix of it, because we didn't dip too far into the surplus zone, but it happened to coincide exactly as we started importing more stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Since early 2000, the U.S. current account deficit has begun growing and growing. And if you take the comprehensive picture where you incorporate government budget and current account surplus, you'll totally see that right before the Great Recession, the current account surplus, the current account deficit grew very large, and private sector's net saving once again dipped into negative territory. So that was ultimately the reason for the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009.
So let's talk some current events then, because I want to bring up Donald Trump, who has, on many occasions, and part of his campaigning platform was to run under the fact that he wanted to decrease the national deficit. Now, being MMTers that we are, our knee-jerk reaction to that should be, oh my God, don't do that, because every time we've done that, we've crashed the system. But at the same time, one of his other campaign promises is...
Plus, I've always called bullshit on that, by the way. I don't think he's going
I don't think he's going to either. Let's. I do want to address that too. But to finish this, to finish this comment, he simultaneously is talking about getting the current accounts adjusted a little bit better. Or I don't know if it's better or not, but get it adjusted so we're not importing so much stuff that the United States can start, making stuff again, and maybe even export some stuff.
Yeah.
So
export. I mean, they do export a lot, but it's just he wants to export more than we import, I guess.
So I kind of agree with you that I don't really think he intends to do anything about the national deficit. Not that I really want him to, because I understand what needs to be done. I think it may be largely speaking to his base, which expects, that they think that the government is a household, and that, it shouldn't be in debt because they feel that, or that they feel is not the right word. They think, and I mean, it's not strange why they think this, that they're the ones that are going to have to foot the bill for the government spending too much. Now, we know this isn't the case, and I somewhat sort of suspect Trump of knowing that this is not the case, but he may have to, speak to his base a certain way and make some minor concessions that he cut this small thing or cut that small thing, or quit giving $300 million aid to Pakistan. I don't know if that was the Pentagon's decision recently or not. But whatever the case, it's interesting to see that his efforts on changing the trade imbalance. And I'm curious, first of all, how successful he's going to be. But second of all, if he's successful and he actually manages to really make a change on the trade balance, what sort of economic effects we're going to have here? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely be a boost for GDP if all else being equal, we improve our current account deficit or make it into a surplus. And I think that's really what Trump, at least in his rhetoric, that's really what he wants ultimately. The question is really, from what I've heard from a lot of MMTers, how much of an effect do policymakers really have on the current account balance of the country? I don't know, but maybe through tariffs and other currency maneuvering, etc. maybe it's possible to get there, and we'll have to wait and see. But if that happens, then the country could actually reduce its deficit or run a balanced budget, much like what I was talking about earlier regarding Germany. It would be theoretically conceivable, but it would really mean that foreigners would have to want to hold the dollar or use the dollar less to save and more to spend in the US. And it's almost really a decision on their part more than our policy.
Remind us why all these foreigners have these dollars to begin with.
Because they've sold things into the US and then accumulated them. Basically, the example you gave earlier with the Chinese company that just buys products or sells products to the US that earns dollars, and then the dollars accumulate at the central bank, and then the central bank invests that money into treasury securities. And that's the case in a lot of other countries too. Japan, Germany, etc., where just the US dollars are just accumulating in accounts there, and people are happy holding them. And, some people say it's not even really a problem. However, it is a bit of a problem for Americans if they don't have some sort of fiscal stimulus to boost domestic demand, then it can become a problem. So if that number, as you said, if that number flips and becomes a positive, if it becomes a current account surplus or whatever, it could certainly provide a lot of boost.
Drain the foreign sector.
Yeah, it increases the private sector's net private savings in this country, improves their position, and it would give the government some room for budget cuts if they wanted to. It would certainly move the country closer towards full employment. It would also probably cause a little more inflation than some people would like. But these are all sort of the effects that we could see in this country from a improved trade balance and maybe achieving a current account surplus or lower deficit at one point.
Is a current account surplus naturally inflationary?
I think so, because you basically have a sector.
Money's coming in and goods are going out.
Exactly. You have a sector that's buying away money from buying away products from this country and introducing new money. So it's just 100% purchasing power. They're not introducing new consumer goods simultaneously. If it's a trade surplus, if it's an export surplus, then that tends to be a positive factor on inflation, definitely. Yeah. Alongside, as we discussed last time, a government budget deficit can also cause inflation, and and investment spending can also have that same effect. Now, of course, we're looking at an economy that's not at capacity yet, but certainly the closer we get to capacity, and a current account surplus would lead us there. It would boost employment here, etc. Then it's more likely that it'll cause more inflation.
So, before we get into the Eurozone, this just came to me as well, which is, I've also heard Trump mention this in his speech at the steel mill that recently opened, that a country producing its own steel is actually kind of a matter of national security.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've thought about, where we've had this slow, consistent drain for like the last 20 or 30 years of companies leaving the United States, is that at what point when we stop producing so much, or when we start producing so little, that if another country or even if a group of countries would just say, you know what, we're turning your necessities off. Bye.
Yeah, it's a political choice,
and then we get stuck. Yeah, well, yeah, it's a political choice, but I mean, I can really see the concern of national security of just producing your own stuff. Even if you're selling it to somebody else, then at least you have the control over, whether or not we're going to decide to stop selling it to those other people. But if all your factories are turned off and in ruins, and half your population is unemployed, And then the only way you're surviving is other countries are selling you stuff. And if those other countries, for whatever reason, were either decided to or were unable to provide you that stuff.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
You're just out in the desert on your own.
You become dependent on other political forces, yeah. You don't want that for basic materials, I'm sure.
And because I think, well, and I don't know if national security is really the best way to describe it. Maybe, man, I don't know if you can think of a better word. I'll just keep using national security. If we compare the two forces of national security to inflation, because many of us, I don't like inflation, are very, very concerned about, government spending or anything really leading to more inflation. And I think there's kind of I don't know, what am I going to call it, a disease? Where people are so freaked out about inflation, they'll sacrifice everything else. They'll sacrifice employment, they'll sacrifice national security in the terms that I'm using it right now, in order to not have that inflation, or at least think that they're not going to have it. But it's really interesting when we break it down at these levels to say, okay, inflation is an important thing to look at, but there's also other important things to look at, and we kind of have to have a rational adult conversation about, okay, which is the most important thing right now?
Yeah. And I mean,
what do you think, Nima?
I think inflation is tricky because at the same time we say that we want to have the market determine prices. But then suddenly we say, oh, no, now prices are going up. That's not good. So it's not really easy to determine. But in general, I think you're right. It's that people are way too fickle about inflation. That there's even research that suggests it's not really necessarily much of a problem unless it gets into, hyperinflation territory. Then, of course, but then it's a symptom of, as we discussed before, it's a symptom of collapsing productive capacity in the country. So yeah, that's definitely, and then the Fed has its arbitrary 2% inflation target in the Eurozone. I mean, these are arbitrary numbers. There's nothing behind that. There's nothing substantial behind that.
Can you repeat that last part again, just for me? I think it came through. You got garbled up on my end. What was it about the Eurozone and made up numbers?
The Eurozone and the US, they have, the Eurozone is different. Well, I was just talking about the inflation target. The Fed has an inflation target of 2%. I think the European Central Bank has that same inflation target. So, and then at the same time, they think they make policy. They think they can steer inflation and direct inflation, which
with interest rates.
Which we discussed. They really can't, but still they make policy decisions based on that myth. And so, but these numbers are arbitrary ultimately. There's no real substantive facts or nothing backing up those figures. Just that they say, well, it would be nice. It looks nice if we just run 2% inflation per year, no more. But then what if it's 5% one year? Then is that the end of the world? And why? And how do you know? It's just ridiculous, actually. It's just all based on the assumption that austerity and falling prices is the default state, and it's a good thing. And it's really, if you look at the history of money and economics over the past 5,000 years, etc., it's not really how things work. The normal state is more like some level of baseline inflation.
So before we get going on a conversation on baseline inflation, because that's really its own show right there.
Yeah.
Let's hop over to the Eurozone. So the Eurozone is kind of a unique thing in monetary history as far as I understand.
Yeah.
Because when we look at most countries, particularly if they're a floating exchange rate, as most countries are today, which is they're not pegged to anything, whether that's gold or a foreign currency, the country has the policy ability to print its own money and spend it into existence at its own will. Now, when you do peg a currency, for example, I actually think China is actually pegged to the dollar, isn't it?
Yeah, to an extent. They change the rate sometimes, but they defend a certain rate, yeah.
Yeah, and so China's a little bit different example because they have so many dollars that they can play around with it. But for a smaller country, if they peg their currency, say, to the dollar, and they got to generate dollars in order to buy things, well, they can't create their own dollars, so they have to tax in order to spend, or they have to do something, get a trade surplus or something to get those dollars in, because they're relying on a foreign entity to create their currency, whereas something like the United States or something like Canada or something like Japan can just make its own currency whenever it needs it. Now, what's crazy about the Eurozone is every single country in the Eurozone is not sovereign over its own currency.
Yeah.
So every single Eurozone country is essentially using a foreign currency to run its country.
Yeah, it's a very odd construct.
But the foreign currency isn't created by a country, though. It's this bizarre. I don't even know what insults to hurl at it.
The countries can create the foreign currency, but only within limits, right? So they can run some sort of deficit, and as we know, deficit creates new currency, but only up to 3%. Here's another arbitrary number, because Mitterrand at one point way back in the day said that, well, number 3 sounds good, the Holy Trinity and all makes sense to me, so let's go with the number 3. 3 it is. 3%.
Well, slow that one down. Flesh out that story. So every single European country, now we all know that they don't necessarily abide by this rule, but they essentially have this deficit ceiling where they're only supposed to spend up to 3% of GDP?
Yes.
Okay, so the deficit is only supposed to be 3% of GDP, and this number 3 came from where?
Because the French president at the time, he liked the number and he thought the Holy Trinity, the 3 is just a good number. Let's go with that number. Basically,
so it wasn't off his economics PhD thesis.
No,
is what you're saying?
No.
So he essentially pulled a number out of a hat.
Yes.
So the one of the most important economic factors that a country has, which is its control over its deficit, has been decided by this number drawn out of a hat.
Yeah.
Now, when you brought this up to me in a separate conversation, and when it clicked to me what this meant, my jaw went through the floor, because what this means is that essentially every country that got involved in the Eurozone and continues to get involved in the Eurozone essentially gets its economic situation frozen in time. Because if they have a bad GDP and they need a deficit to spend their way out of it, they can't do it. And if they have a great GDP to begin with, and 3% or even less can cut it, then they're doing okay. And you're the one who provided the evidence for me. The economic history since that time seems to back it up. Every country that was doing great when they got in is doing great now, and every country that was doing bad at the time is doing bad now.
Yeah, the best example I think is Germany, because Germany, when they first got in, or when they first started harmonizing the currencies, I guess, Germany had a current account surplus. They were known to be a big exporter nation and also a big private saver nation for that reason, in part. And here we come back to our sectoral balances. So we have Germany, a country with high export surpluses, or rather high current account surpluses, high private sector savings, and a pretty balanced budget, or low budget deficit surpluses from time to time. And then they basically locked in their currency exchange rates against all the other Euro countries. So now their currency can't move up from their current account surplus, and thus provide an incentive for them to buy products from abroad at cheaper prices. None of those stabilizing factors exist anymore when all the currencies are basically put into one currency and all harmonized together. And so Germany has been running a current account surplus consistently from 2000, even 99 onwards. I think it's just expanded it more and more, especially over these past 20 years. But they've always been an exporter country. So they've been able to accumulate private sector net savings at the cost of a lot of other European countries. And we'll provide a chart.
So they're essentially cannibalizing the other European countries, right?
Yeah, because for example, if we look at Greece, I have a chart here. It starts at 99, goes through 2016. In 99, they had a current account deficit, and they had a smaller budget deficit. So as we know from our calculation, that means that the private sector is net dis-saving. Private sector has to sell net financial assets or go in debt to the public sector. And that has been going on from 99 through 2008 consistently until they hit their depression. So they're basically running a current account deficit and a far too small budget deficit, and thus the private sector's net dis-saving, or rather the private sector's indebtedness, grew until it became so unsustainable that in 2009 they had their depression. And then over time they started reducing their imports and building a net private savings position again, starting in 2009. And now they're supposedly out of the woods, and the European Stability Mechanism is done with their work with Greece. So they're happy, and they're sort of having a victory lap over that. But we'll see where that goes, because they still aren't allowed to. They're not supposed to run balanced budgets, if I'm not mistaken. Now they have reduced.
They are supposed to, or they're not supposed to?
They're supposed to, according to the IMF. They're supposed to run a budget. Balanced budget, I think, pretty soon, actually. And so then the question is, well, are they going to start importing from abroad again, or are they going to be able to start flipping their current account balance? We'll see about that. But for now, they've been able to turn around since the depression, but the question remains how stable their private sector is going to be over the next coming years and decades, of course.
Well, and it's funny because I remember 2009 when the recommendation or the criticism aimed at Greece was that, well, this is what happens when you run up too much debt. Sounds like you need to start cutting back, and you need some austerity to help fix things. And now we know that the austerity, it just makes it worse.
Right.
So it's frustrating to look up at Germany because of this trade balance, the effects of the foreign sector, and because essentially all the countries in the Eurozone are kind of living within their own foreign sector. It's like we said, it's this historical oddity. Germany can sit there and run a balanced budget because it's exporting all its cars and beer and whatever else, and go, oh, look how,
look at these
responsible we are over our books.
Yeah.
Oh man, look at all you guys just messing stuff up. Well, the reason Germany is able to do that is because they're sucking all the money out of countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy.
Well, yeah,
because
Italy,
Germany's,
I don't know.
Well, maybe not Italy.
Yeah. But yeah, Spain had a similar problem until 2008. They were also Greece is the most striking example, because I don't think any country imports as much as Greece relative to their exports. But Spain had a similar situation, but they turned it around pretty well in 2009. They started running much bigger deficits at that point. And Italy has always sort of been, at least they've been able to accumulate savings sufficiently. So they haven't had that kind of crisis as Greece did. So, but yeah, definitely, Germany, in short, Germany is definitely living on the backs of a lot of net importers in the Eurozone.
So, short of these countries, going back to their currencies, which I'm not necessarily against. However, I'm an amateur when it comes to this economic stuff. What sort of thing could allow these countries to get control over their money again, even if they stay on the euro?
Well, I think there's different possibilities. One is, as you said, they just all go back. That you have a orderly breakup. They go back to their own currencies, and then they have fiscal sovereignty again. And then the other possibility is they could you could have a European treasury. Then the Eurozone could become like the US, basically. You'd have a European treasury that can spend euros into existence, and they're going to, in the US, the Defense Department, for example, decides to build plants, or Boeing or whatever, or make their contractors build plants in deficit regions so that they can inject more net saving in those areas. And so the European Treasury could, I guess, do something along those lines. Start deficit spending in Europe, start deficit spending in Greece, maybe have a job guarantee program, but they're probably not going to do that.
Right, we talked about last time.
Yeah, but it would have to be either, I think it's the two extremes. You could either do a complete decentralization, a complete breakup, or you could go to complete centralization with the European Treasury. But I don't think the middle of the road solution is going to work for a while. It's just going to be this constant meandering through depression and, mild growth and recession again that we see right now. And maybe they're just trying to prime the people to get used to the European Treasury. Maybe they want people to get so frustrated with the situation that they'll just come asking for the solution. Problem, reaction, solution, basically.
So, I'm not sure I fully understood the Treasury thing, which is, are you saying that each country would kind of have access, be able to dip its hands into the create euros out of nothing as much as they want?
It could be that. I mean, it could be that just get rid of the 3%.
3%
limit.
Deficit ceiling.
Yeah. Or you just keep that. Like in the US, you have a similar situation. Like the states are not allowed, actually most states are not allowed to run a deficit. Or at least they have to submit a balanced budget every year. They can somehow then fail to implement that, but they have to submit a balanced budget. But states are very limited in the US. That's why, the federal government is the entity that can spend net financial assets into existence. So in Euroland, you could have similar situations where you just create a political European treasury. We have a European central bank, but we don't have a European treasury. And the European treasury,
I see what you're saying,
would just act outside of the different nation states governments and start hiring people and start spending euros into existence.
Further destroying these individual countries' national sovereignty.
Yes. Well, that would be probably... That's what this whole project is about, right? I mean, that's what the European Union is all about.
Because, I remember when I lived in Europe, I stayed with this guy for a while in Austria, and we were talking about aspects of the Eurozone, and he said, the best way to think about it is that the Eurozone, or the European Union, is like the United States, where the individual countries are like states. And at the time, I didn't really have anything to say to him, but now I know better, where that's totally not the case. Because in the United States, we have this thing called states' rights, which, may or may not be as effective as the founding fathers had intended it to be, but there's still the precedent there and courts that'll uphold it in some cases, where, the states are supreme, except for these, few things that the federal government is supposed to be supreme on. One of them is money creation. Now, in the European Union, European law supersedes any individual country's law, period.
Yeah.
So, and when I was in Austria, I remember a lot of people complaining about this, where it's like, particularly Austria, because they kind of like to, I don't feel they're as cosmopolitan as the rest of Europe. We're like, oh yeah, we're all in this together. Like, no, we like being Austria, and we like the way we do things here. Where we had a tradition, and it was backed by this law, but it's against European law, so now we're fighting. But the European Union always wins because that's the way it's set up. They always win.
Yeah.
So if it finally comes down to where the Eurozone essentially gets to start saying, okay, we're going to inject money in these places, I keep saying Eurozone, the European Union gets to say, well, we're going to open this treasury and start injecting money into the places where we just feel like it, regardless of whatever country it's in. Yeah, that really destroys the national sovereignty of each individual nation. So,
yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm just reinforcing what you said.
The national sovereignty of every individual nation is already being eroded every year. That's the whole point of the European Union, right? So,
right. Yeah.
So this would just,
and I think the Treasury would really kick the can way.
Well, the Treasury would. It's probably what they want
road.
all along, anyway. I suspect, but they just have to produce the conditions within the countries to make the people demand it. So there's. There's also the refugee crisis, which I think at one point it may create a European citizenship type of situation, similar to what we had in the US, where we had slavery, and then US citizenship was only created as a concept when slavery was abolished, because the states didn't want the slaves who were now freed, and the US government created the US citizenship. And I wonder if maybe something like that,
which forced them to be. Yeah.
I wonder if something like that is what they have in store for the millions of refugees that are currently being herded into Europe. Just make them.
Well, that's a freaky thing to think about.
Make them European citizens, and then every country has to accept them or something like that. But anyway, we're so far from that. But I just think,
But before we go down there, that's kind of blackpilling. Let's.
but
we're supposed to be empowering
people. I'm just talking about how they are using these long-term conditioning techniques, and to make people accept the European Treasury may just be one of those things. Ultimately, that would, of course, because that would really give the European state really a lot of power, because the power of the purse is the power to dish out favors and to invest and to launch projects, etc. So yeah, I think that may be what they ultimately are hoping for. Yeah. But just from an economic standpoint, if we are not political, if we don't want to be political, we can just say, well, if we want to have economic growth, it can work in either scenario. Just one is with national sovereignty, the other without. Which one you prefer is a political choice, but the economics still apply. You need to have some kind of entity to inject net financial assets that are safe and that give the private sector the financial position that they are looking for to be able to spend and invest, etc. And if you're the monopoly supplier of these net financial assets, then there's no other way to get them into the economy than by spending into existence.
Right, which, to back up your point, the remedies that, typical people, and I guess even typical politicians, typical pundits, throw at the Eurozone is you're going to have to go through austerity, and you're going to have to start, cutting your deficits. Not only is that, wrong, and potentially causing the problem, pushing towards the European Treasury, as Nima just mentioned, but it's like the issue is so artificially exacerbated, where it's like, I mean, just as we talked about before, if we want to improve the economy here in the United States, one of the easiest things you could do is just stop taxing so much. Yeah. Just change a few numbers in the tax code. Where over in Europe, I mean, same thing with the tax code, just change a few numbers there. But get rid of this 3% deficit crap.
But the two are tied.
Recognize these things.
Two go hand in hand. You can't cut the taxes unless you get rid of the 3% deficit. But that would be the solution for them if they want to do something quick. just cut out payroll taxes. I mean, Europe is so overtaxed, it's ridiculous. I'm from Germany. I know, you pay a lot more than you pay over here. And so
I was hitchhiking in Germany, and this self-employed trucker picked me up.
Yeah.
And what did he say? He said, you work from January to June for the government, and you work from July to December for yourself.
Yeah.
That's how much you get taxed.
Yeah. That's very true. Yeah, that would be easy for them to implement, but at the same time, I guess it's not easy because they are not really interested. They want to create one country. That's their objective. So to hell with the people who are suffering.
Well, and then, I mean, even to the people who are living there, I think this is useful information because they might even think themselves, because they don't understand this, is to say, okay, yeah, we did spend too much. Maybe we have to go through austerity in order to, clean this out, where, we can let them know, look, no, you don't have to do that at all. You got it backwards. And in fact, you should be wanting to spend more because that's getting more of your national sovereignty back.
Yeah, austerity is never the solution, really. Unless maybe you're in the rare situation where you add capacity and you start running to inflation. But and then in this situation, it's not
really austerity at that
point.
Right.
No, it's just
no one's starving
right.
That's just like, stop putting the nitro in the gasoline sort of situation.
But in general, other than that, austerity is always just an artificial suppression of wealth creation. That's unnecessary. And it's unnecessary because taxes could be lower than they are.
Yeah. Well, I think we can leave it at that. Taxes could be lower than they are. So with that, thanks again, Nima, for the conversation. I really love these.
It's been a pleasure.
Show notes will be in the links below, or the links will be in the show notes below. And we hope to see you next time for episode 4.